Well, tonight we're going to be back looking at the social background to the intertestamental period. We just introduced the social strata of the Roman Empire and the social strata seen in Palestine, and we were just beginning to get into some of the meaty part of our discussion and looking at the money changer. Now, one thing we've not done is we've not gone all the way up to the passages themselves, looking at them and commenting on them, which is what we're going to be beginning to do tonight. We're going to get through with that and get into another subject as well. But let's go back and refresh our memory. We're talking about the different classes of society. The Roman Empire, there are only two classes, the upper class, the lower class. The upper class is made up of those who have descended from the senators, to aristocratic landowners, speaking in general truths, as well as the equestrian rank. The lower class is made up of slaves and free men. Now, Palestine has the same situation, a twofold division of the social strata. Unlike America, remember, America has a threefold division, and then three in each of those, which makes it a ninefold division. But really we have three. We have upper, middle, lower. Palestine had a two-class society, the upper, the lower. The upper is generally made up of people with religious connections. The scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, particularly the Sadducees above the scribes and the Pharisees. The Sadducees, as well as members of the Sanhedrin, many of which, if not most, were part of the Sadducean clan, as well as the high priest. The high priest and their descendants, such as Annas, his son-in-law Caiaphas, and Annas has sons himself, are the ones who end up at the very top of Jewish society. Jewish society had the lower class as well. The lower class, although it comprised slaves in other parts of the Roman Empire, very, very few of the Jewish people were actually slaves. Perhaps half of the population of the Roman Empire was in slavery. But for the most part, the Jewish people were exempt from this. There were only two ways that you could end up in the upper class, either by birth, born into an important religious family, or by one of two money occupations. This is all on your outline too, by the way. First of those money occupations we will refer to as the changer of money, the money changer. And it worked like this. We'll review this and it will bring us up to date. The Old Testament law in Exodus chapter 30 had established that a half-shekel temple tax was due annually by males of a certain age in Israel. Now, after the Babylonian captivity and the diaspora of the people, the Jewish men, as well as women, the Jewish people, are scattered all throughout the Roman Empire. And yet to be a good Jew, to be a faithful Jew, meant that you had to keep up with your annual half-shekel temple tax, according to Exodus chapter 30, that began whenever you turned 20. Now, that was not the age of maturity, neither was it the age of manhood, nor the age of the official male in Israel. That starts years earlier. But it was the age around which a man generally started earning his own wage, and therefore it was required over the age of 20 for men the half-shekel temple tax. Now, we have a problem. We had no problem in Old Testament Israel when the shekel was the current and common Hebrew means of exchange. However, by the time we come to the New Testament, we have most money in circulation being that of Roman and Greek coinage, the denarius, the drachma, the Roman and the Greek coin. Those were not acceptable in the temple, and therefore, according to tractate number 15, shekelim in the Talmud, the law was established which gave the priests the right to state what type of money would be accepted in the temple in Jerusalem. This was, of course, prior to its downfall. The temple in Jerusalem from the Jewish people. There was not Roman coin, the denarius. It could not be Greek, the drachma. It could not be the Hebrew shekel, which had passed off the scene by this time. But it has to be something that's basically an equivalent. Well, you could have made, and we've converted the values, you could have made either the denarius or the drachma, the equivalent of the Old Testament Hebrew shekel. But everyone has that, and therefore that would rule out the need for a changer of money, a money changer, since you would all have probably the Latin coins, and maybe many of you at this day and this time would still have Greek coins as well. And so what it set up, it just paved the way for a lucrative business for the priest Annas and his son set up tables in the court of the Gentiles. The precincts of the temple were divided up into the following parts. First of all, you'd come into the court of the Gentiles, then into the court of the women, then into the court of the men, then into the court of the priests, and then you'd have the temple proper. So you've got 4 courts through which you have to go to reach the temple proper. Now, Gentiles, upon pain of death, were restricted from entering the second and beyond courts. They were restricted, in other words, to what became known as the court of the Gentiles, the court of the nations. They could only go that far. Beyond that, the women could go, then beyond that, the men could go, then beyond that, the priests can go, and then beyond that, only the high priest, and that once a year, all the way into the Holy of Holies. Well, now this was an interesting setup, and it comes to play many times in the Gospels, how these religious people corner the market around the temple for the first catch in the relationship, and that is that although God and we will require an annual half-shekel temple tax, we require it in our own stated coinage, what we want, not the denarius and not the drachma. The other catch was that not only would they have to pay their annual temple tax of the half-shekel, but they'd also have to bring just their stated offerings, their fellowship offerings, their peace offerings, their sin offerings, their trespass offerings, their burnt offerings, their meal offerings, and so forth. Now, the scenario which we had drawn for you before goes as follows. If you live in Spain and you're trying to make it to Palestine at Pentecost, Tabernacles, or Passover, it's difficult to bring enough animals as well as meal, as well as incense, frankincense, this type of business. It's difficult to bring enough of that, if not impossible, to offer your sacrifices legitimately in a Jewish temple. And so the other catch to this little law that affected the money changers as well was that, well, just turn all of your money into local money in Spain, then which would be the drachma, the denarius, and then bring that whenever you come to Jerusalem. You'll have your half shekel, what equals the half shekel temple tax along with you, as well as a lot of other money. When you get to the temple, A, you can transfer some of that money, turn it into the appropriate coinage for your half shekel temple tax. And then B, you also will need to buy your animals in order to offer your sacrifice. And yet we won't accept that money to buy your animals, so you can turn the rest of it into the money changers. They'll change that, and then his son-in-law, his brother, his cousin also sat beside him. You changed his money, and then your brother-in-law sold him a couple of cows or an ox or two with the money that you just changed for him. The catch to it all is 12% surcharge was allowed on the changing of the money. Now, it was especially profitable during the times of the 3 annual festivals in Israel, because so many thousands would come to Jerusalem at this time. Now, the tables of the money changers, so familiar from Sunday school, you'll remember, the tables of the money changers stay there all the time. But it's just that business increases. I mean, the stores exist out there in our country all the time, but wait till you get around holiday season. All of a sudden, certain seasons of the year, you have more people come, which spend more money. Doesn't even matter what the price is, you have to buy something, and that's the time to raise prices. And then they lower them after the season's over with, you know, because people have to buy then. Most people have to buy then. Let's turn to some of these passages. Matthew chapter 21. We'll find it on 3 occasions mentioned here in the New Testament, the money changers. Now, you see the point why we're looking at this. This was one way. Now, generally, I've said that the money changer did not increase his status, social status in life by money occupation, because if he got into the temple as such, into the precincts of the temple as a money changer, that probably came about as a result of his birth. He was born into the right family, into a religious family anyway. But that's not always true. That is true too many of the times. So that would fit back with birth and not with money occupation exclusively. Matthew 21, looking at the 12th verse and then a few verses after that, we'll see where this is brought into the picture. We see how we're ending up now with a certain class, a class in society, a certain class here in Palestine, and classes, you know as well as I know, are always based upon finances, or based upon what you possess in life. Generally, if you're a blue blood, you're rich as well. You're not just born into the right family because it goes back 500 years, but they happen to be a rich family as well. Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple. Okay, the sold, that would be the people with the money changers. The bought would just be the people coming in trying to purchase something. And overthrew the tables of the money changers. And there is where we find that term. Overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves. And said to them, it's written, my house should be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. Now, not only would they buy doves, but they would have to have lambs, bulls, wine, oil, cattle, oxen, salt, and incense, just to mention a few things that would have to be bought. Remember the so-called covenant of salt. Thou shalt not offer thy sacrifices with salt lacking. So you're not going to bring a block of salt along with you. Leave that for the deer behind you and buy some salt whenever you actually arrive there. Doves, lambs, bulls, cattle, oxen, goats, wine, oil, salt, incense, and doves. It was a regular Oriental bazaar whenever you walked into the temple precinct. I'll go over that list again. I think I'm reading them too fast for you. And I'm reading them in all different directions. Cattle, oxen, lambs, goats, bulls, doves, wine, oil, salt, incense, ad infinitum for various things that could be bought, such as herbs and spices as well. And these things, conveniently enough, were kept nearby for pilgrim purchase. Now, can you imagine what it must have been like to try to go and worship God in the temple? With the smell of the dung of the animals and the mooing of the cattle, the fluttering of the dove's wings, the lowing of the oxen, the hawking of animals, the clicking of coins being changed, and you're trying to come in there and worship the God of heaven. You see, Jesus, that's why it's no small problem for him at all. And this had been established by the sons of Annas, and it just goes on and on and on. Quite religiously lucrative business that they have on their hands here. They are the ones who established this for themselves. Now, the law of God didn't say something like this. And they would argue on the basis of convenience. Well, if the Jews are going to come from another part of the world, or if Gentiles were going to come from another part of the world, there were Gentiles who had come, like the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. He came to the temple to worship. Well, worship meant that you had to offer the correct type of sacrifice. Well, he couldn't bring that. He would also have to buy sacrifices as well. And so they're arguing on the basis of convenience. Surely they could have brought the animals along with them and taken a 14-year leave of absence from work to get there and get home. Surely they could have bought animals from local Jews around, but that would have done the same damage as it did there in the temple. Everyone would be greedy for money, and there'd just be signs along the way. You know, certain stretches of the highway, people are crying out, stop at my store here, and it's who got the biggest sign, the fanciest display out there. Well, the Jews would have the same thing, like a stuffed ox outside in the front porch, so you'd know you can buy ox if you want to stop here. Or maybe a cage of dove on the front porch. Here's where you can buy what you need for the temple at the end of your journey here. So what's the most convenient thing? Just get it all done. It's called one-stop banking. Just get it all done here at the same place. That was their society. It's kind of like our society. Do it in as few stops as possible. You can worship God. You can have all your sins for a whole year atoned for. You can change your coins. You can buy your, what? Your lambs, bulls, goats, wine, oil, cattle, oxen, salt, incense, doves, spices, herbs. You can buy it all at one stop. And just be out of there in a matter of moments. You know, they had tables in there. Tables, plural, of money changers, plural. Just tables and tables. And when the right festival comes along, we've got the more people there. People, people, people. Money changers everywhere. Just go to the table with the shortest line in it. You know how that works. You're always looking for the shortest line. Get in line there. Have your figures ready in your mind. And probably be shocked by the 12% surcharge. Really, you already knew that's what they were going to charge. No one's going to do it for free. They should have done it for free, though. The people came to worship God, and you're charging people to worship God. Not just charging them, but you're trying to make a profit on them. And then you set it up in such a way that even if they want to do something differently, there's nothing else that can be done. You've got to come, you've got to worship, you have to have the correct coins. They won't even accept them in the treasury in the temple. You have to have the animals and so forth. So here it's found in Matthew 21:12. Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all those that sold and bought and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. And verse 14, the blind, the lame came to him in the temple. Now you've got room for some other things to happen there. You get rid of the oxen and the cattle, and the blind and the lame come to be healed. When the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did. Well, that's wonderful from Matthew's point of view, not from their point of view. Wonderful things. He cleansed the temple, and he healed the sick. And they liked neither of the above. The children crying in the temple saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. They were sore displeased. He said unto them, Hearest thou what these say? They said to him, Hearest thou what these say? Jesus saith unto them, Yes, I hear, and have ye never read, Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings thou hast perfected praise. He left them and went out of the city into Bethany, and he lodged there. In the morning he returns, and so forth. Then if you'll look in Mark chapter 11, we'll find this account again. Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 17. They come to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. You find it very, very similar, well, almost identical to what Matthew had stated. And would not allow that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he taught, saying unto them, so forth. We'll get to this quotation here in a moment. Now, verse 16. Now that's unlike anything that you'll find anywhere else in the gospel account. Verse 16, would not allow that any man should carry any vessel to the temple. It's not exactly known what is stated there. Probably it's not just a duplication of verse 15, though. We see what verse 15 is talking about, the money changer and the selling of animals, and that all goes together. It's the same occupation, the same people involved in that. It's unlikely that that's just going to be a duplication. So let's look at a diagram here. Let's give ourselves the eastern wall of the city of Jerusalem. I'll kind of simplify it. That's what I'll do. I'm going to try to make it a little too long. We'll give ourselves the temple, which would think like this. And give us the court of the priests, and the court of men, the court of the women, and the court of the Gentiles. Gentiles, women, men, priests of the temple. And then you've got the whole precinct of the temple that would look something like this. They're not after all. And you remember Antonia is up here on the north. Okay, then you've got the pool of Bethesda up here. You've got the sheep gate over here. You have the lower city of Jerusalem down here. Now, why is it whenever you live in the neighborhood of your local school on the corner that there is a path right across the corner of your yard? It's called a shortcut. Those worn places in the grass where they avoid walking on the neatly paved sidewalk there, those worn places in the grass are called shortcuts. Okay, with that in mind, verse 16, and would not allow that any man should take a shortcut through the temple precinct, carry any vessel. What appears to have taken place is you're down here in the lower city, you want to get up here to the pool, or you're up here at one of the functions here, you want to get down here to the lower city, and so you just walk right in the midst of all the people who are trying to serve God while these other people are trying to make money, but someone's trying to serve God here and taking a shortcut to get down to your thing that you want to do, instead of go the long way, go all the way around here to get to your destination. So in other words, he is trying to uphold the sanctity of the Lord's temple here. First of all, in prohibiting any sale of these various goods. An Oriental bazaar is what they have. And secondly, in forbidding the use of the precincts of the temple as a shortcut for man's laziness. And then he goes on to say, he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Okay, he quotes two passages here, Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. Now let's look these up and see what they mean and see what his point is then. Isaiah 56 and verse 7. One of the points is, I think, obvious there. The other is not. Do you know why does he do what he does? Well, I just said he's preserving the sanctity of the temple, but he gives us a quote and telling us exactly the 2 points that he has behind what he does, exactly what he's doing. Do you have any idea the reasons behind this? Well, let's look at these verses then. Isaiah 56:7. We're probably going to have to go back a little earlier. Verse 3. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, The Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. Now, this is a future prophecy. And you can tell right there it's a prophecy of people outside of the Jewish faith. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, The Lord hath utterly separated me from his people, the Jewish people. Then he goes on in verses 4 and 5 to give promises to the eunuch. Also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it and taking hold of my covenant. And it's obvious that the context here is a prophecy of the Gentiles and not of the Jews. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. Now, you probably never knew what this verse said or what it's really talking about here. Tremendous. Let's read that 7th verse again. This is part of what he's quoting. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain. This is one of those verses that appears to have double application, because we know once you get beyond Isaiah chapter 40, much, if not most, of what he has to say, from 40 to 66, those 27 chapters there, has reference to what we would call end-time events, and that is things that will take place in the context of the second advent. And yet Jesus quotes this as having some type of application for his day and time. And make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar. Now, if I had not told you this, you might not have caught the fact that in reading Isaiah chapter 56, what you're supposed to think of would be the Gentiles and not the Jews. For mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. So he's predicting, Isaiah is predicting with the spirit of prophecy that the Gentiles one day would come to the house of the Lord. They'd be joyful in this house. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices would be acceptable. And they would be a part of the people of prayer because they came to the place called the house of prayer. So this is quoted in the first part in Matthew 21:12 to 13 and in Mark 11:15 to 17. He gives two quotations, one from Isaiah, one from Jeremiah. What's his point? His point here seems to be the following. Why quote this? He taught them, saying, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations a house of prayer? Evidently he's quoting this because the institution of the money-changing system, which necessitates all the people, all the tables, and all the goods to be bought, disturbed the worship of the Gentiles. Evidently, he was not even that concerned about the Jews. We've painted this scenario of the Jews coming from Spain and the Jews coming from Rome. What about the Gentiles? What about either the God-fearers, A, or B, the proselytes, which were two different groups of people? Proselytes went further in the Jewish faith than the God-fearers did. But God-fearers came. Proselytes came. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 is our best example there, who made a trip all the way from Ethiopia up to Jerusalem to worship the Lord God. He even had the scroll of the prophet Isaiah with him, remember, and was reading the 53rd chapter on the way back home when Philip joined him in the chariot. So there's our best example in the New Testament of one, a Gentile who comes to the house of God. Why is he quoting this? He's quoting, we have to understand this, he's quoting from a Gentile chapter, from a Gentile passage there. And we can see this in the quotation, my house shall be called of all nations. See, now, Old Testament, this is the house of prayer for the Jews. When the Jew is scattered, 1 Kings chapter 8, in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, when the Jew is scattered into all parts of the world, that was thinking of Babylonian captivity as well. Then, if they'll turn their eyes and look toward this holy place and pray, then God in heaven will hear their prayer, forgive their sins, heal their land, and so forth. 2 Chronicles 7:14. It's thinking and speaking of Jewish people. With a reference quoted from Isaiah 56:7, the way we see it here in the context in which it appears in Matthew 21 and Mark 11, we can only think of Gentiles, though. It never would have said, my house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer. So what he is concerned about is the fact that all of this will disturb the worship of the Gentiles, God-fearers, potential proselytes, and those who have gone through the rites of proselytism themselves. And remember where I said all of these tables were set up, the court of the Gentiles. At least if you were a Jewish woman, you could get past this, and there was a wall that had various signs on it that stated upon pain of death, a Gentile could not go past this wall, this barrier here. And we hear these various things in the New Testament, that this wall has been broken down, this wall of partition, Colossians chapter 2. Some people get in their minds the veil within the temple. Well, that's not what he's talking about there. That doesn't have anything to do, because not even the Jew could go beyond that. So what's this middle wall of partition that's been broken down? That's not the veil of the temple, so you could get to God, because the point in Colossians 2 is Jew and Gentile will mingle together and form one body. Well, here's the wall of partition right here. All Gentiles stay on the east side, and the Jews to go to the west of that. And then the women to go one step, the men two, and the priests three. So if you were a woman in Israel, you could get past. That's why he's not that concerned for the Jewish people themselves. Even if you came from Spain, if you're still a Jewish woman, you're a Jewish woman. You're not a Gentile woman. You can get past all the clamor and the racket and the Oriental bazaar that's going on out here. By just going inside the gate, past this wall into the court of the women. The men could really get separated. The priests could really get separated from all the racket. Who is that going to confuse and disturb the most? The Gentiles who are trying to reach God. And, of course, Jesus is showing right here in what we would call a transition phase of God's dealing with people. Old Testament, New Testament, this is kind of in between, before he's died and the veil has been rent and the old covenant has come to an end. He is showing in this period of transition God's concern for the Gentile people. They've been shown in the Old Testament by the prophecies in Isaiah and other prophets, but they've been shown there. Now he's showing by demonstration, by a very, very vivid demonstration here, that God is very, very concerned with the Gentile people. Concerned to the point that Jesus will go in and stop all of this racketeering involved because it's disturbing the worship of the Gentiles. Now, paint the picture for yourself in your own mind. You're a Gentile coming from America because you know that there's something different about the God in Palestine. You're going to go worship him. And the only place that you can go officially and legally to worship him is in the court of the Gentiles of the Jerusalem temple. When you get there, you see dishonest men. You see a religion that's based on externals. You see a leadership, an ecclesiastical order that's based on gain is godliness philosophy here. And what does that do to the view that you have of the God of these people then? Won't that severely damage then your view of God, your whole spiritual religious life then? Doesn't that paint just the reverse image of what the Old Testament paints of God? It certainly does. So it's a tremendous, tremendous problem that exists in the New Testament day. So this is not something insignificant that we're looking at here in the intertestamental period. We have to understand how these things have arisen, or we have no hope of understanding what is a money changer. We say, well, we know what a money changer is. He's one exchanges money. But you don't know anything about the denarius, the drachma, the silver coinage from Tyre that's been minted there. And even you say, well, you don't have to know that. Even if you don't know that, you still don't get the deeper implications of these events that have taken place here unless you understand what's going on. Now, the second half of his teaching in Matthew 21 and Mark 11 is based on a quotation from Jeremiah 7:11. Now, this is entirely different. He's drawing 2 points together. This is entirely different than what we are finding here in Isaiah. Jeremiah 7:11. Is this house which is called by my name, and now it's house in my name, just like in Isaiah, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord.
For the continuation of this message,
is this house which is called by my name, and now it's house in my name, just like in Isaiah, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. Well, let's go back and look a little earlier in this chapter like we did with Isaiah. There's the verse from which he is quoting. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, stand in the gate of the Lord's house. Now this is Old Testament. This is Solomonic temple now, before it's been destroyed. And proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord, all ye of Judah, that enter in at these gates to worship the Lord. I could even go so far as to say this. Understanding things about the temple is one of the greatest things you have to do to really understand a lot of the teaching of the Bible. So much is based on the temple, the various ministries, even the diagram, the design of the temple itself, the various functions of various parts of the temple. Like most people don't have any idea how to divide the temple up, and that is a very easy way that we're dividing it up there. There's much more that can be said about that. To understand the temple is to understand a lot. Just think that was central. That was so central to Old Testament as well as part of the New Testament worship. That was even central to early Christianity. Acts 3:1. Peter and John went up to the temple to pray at the hour of prayer and heal the lame man there. And in chapter 4, whenever they are released from prison, it's go and stand, or chapter 5, go and stand in the temple and speak all the words of this life to the people. Everything's involving the temple. Paul ends up being arrested in chapter 21 there in the precincts of the temple, the fortress of Antonia. So it's all through the New Testament. It's the temple, the temple, the temple. And that's what we'll see even in those phrases right here. Proclaim this word and say, hear the word of Judah, all ye. Hear the word of the Lord, all ye of Judah, which enter in these gates. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Don't trust in lying words, saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. You see, they had come to the place where as long as the temple was standing, then to them that established the fact that God was with Israel and would never forsake them. And he said, well, those are lying words. Present facts don't necessarily tend to imply that something's going to be eternally true. For if ye truly amend your ways and your doings, if ye truly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if ye oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, neither walk after other gods to your hurt, then will I cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave your fathers forever and ever. Behold, ye trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will ye steal? Notice the first sin. Will ye steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense unto Baal, walk after other gods whom ye know not, and then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered to do all these abominations? Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? See, they don't have money-changing tables set up then. But he's not saying that anybody's robbing anybody in the courts of the temple. He's just saying robbers are coming into the courts, which makes these courts and this house the place of robbers then, because that's what my people have become. Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. But go ye now unto my place which is in Shiloh, where I set my name at first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. There he is calling back to remembrance former times. Shiloh didn't exist forever, but I raised it to the ground, and Jeremiah is saying, neither shall Jerusalem exist forever, but God will in like manner raise it to the ground, and the temple that stands there as well. So the point of his second quotation is the most obvious one. First of all, we see that they are disturbing the worship of the Gentiles. And with the second quotation, his point is they are practicing extortion on both God's people, the Jews, as well as God's people and the Gentiles. Now those are the two quotations. My house should be called of all nations a house of prayer, Mark 11:17. You're disturbing the worship of those who come to pray. And then secondly, ye have made it a den of thieves, Jeremiah 7:11. They were practicing extortion. Now, this account is found at a different time in history outside of the synoptics in John 2, verses 13 through 17. Now this is at a different time. This is earlier in Jesus. I tell you what, earlier in Jesus' ministry. Before doing that, let me see. I bet I won't be able to find the reference. I bet there's not one. Well, I'll just stay with Mark 11, since maybe you're more familiar with Mark 11 than with the Matthew. In Mark 11, what we have here, maybe some of you already know this, from Mark 11 on through 16, this is the last week in Jesus' life. From 1 to 10, that's part of his early ministry. Then you've got all these last chapters. The cursing of the fig tree, the teaching on faith here, some parables in chapter 12 and so forth. This is the last week of his life. So in other words, my point in saying that is, what feast is just around the corner at this time? Passover is just around the corner at this time. Now, that's what I wanted you to know about Matthew 21 and Mark 11. Now in John 2, verse 13, notice what feast is nigh. Now it's not the same one. It's one a year or so earlier than the one in Matthew 21 and Mark 11. But notice, this is the connection. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. The Jews' Passover. Now these money changers were there all along, all during the year. But it was more frenzy. They were more excited because there was more money to make with more people coming at these 3 times of the year. And found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves. Now, Matthew and Mark only mention dove. John mentions oxen and sheep. And then I've given you some other things, the cattle, goats, and the incense, the frankincense, the salt, the oil, the wine, all the rest that would be stored here. And just try to picture that. You know what it looks like when you go in a supermarket, just the shelves are lined with this. And you are trying to supply the needs of thousands and thousands of Jews as well as Gentiles coming to the temple. And you're going to have oxen, cattle. The court of the Gentiles must have been so crowded. That's the whole point. It was impossible to go in there and worship God at all. That was the court where they were to come and look toward the temple. You can't go beyond that, but come and stop there and look toward the temple and worship God. Pay your money for your sacrifice, do the laying on of hands so your guilt's imputed to that, and let the animal be led off by one of the Levites or one of the priests around to be taken into where the actual altar of burnt offering was and sacrificed up to the Lord. And you're going to have it just filled with crates and boxes and shelves of salt and frankincense and oil, just bottles, and I don't mean glass bottles, but the bottles from the legs of goats and so forth, goat skin bottles, bottles and bottles of wine, blocks and blocks of salt heaped up, and a little sticker on it, 2 for 1 today, and trying to sell all this material to the people there. And they come up to this table and they'll say, now, may I help you? And you fill out your order form here. Take a block of salt, 1 cow, a goat, give me a quart of wine, so much frankincense. You're ordering all this and you pay for it, and then he charges you 12% on top of all of that. Then someone else comes up behind you. And meanwhile, a little Gentile God-fearer is kneeling down beside you trying to worship God, and all she can hear is salt, wine, cow, dove, and she's trying to pray and worship God. What blasphemy in the temple of God is taking place. And so here's what he did. I mean, this was a big court, and he was only one man, and he made a scourge of small cords. He could have found plenty of those laying around the floor that would have tied up the goats and the sheep around there. And he drove them all out of the temple. Now, no one was in the temple. Temple many times is used in a loose sense in the Old and New Testament. You could just paraphrase the court of the Gentiles. That's the only place these people could be. And by the way, there's no way Jewish law would have allowed all of this business transaction to take place any other place except the court of the Gentiles. Why don't they have it in the court of the women? Well, the Jewish women would have complained about that. Well, the Gentiles complained, but who's a Gentile, though? We Jews don't listen to Gentiles. We are a special people. There's no way that you're going to have all of this in one of those interior courts there. It's only out here in the outer court where the poor Gentiles are. He drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep, and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. And he said to them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. He's not quoting one of those 2 specific passages. This is at a different time, and he has a different comment to make. And his disciples remembered that it was written in the book of Psalms, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. So the New Testament authors are just filled with references to the Old in their mind and in their writings. And they remember that there was a verse that said, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. And evidently, John makes correct application, and the apostles, the disciples, made correct identification in their mind between that verse and what Jesus did. Now, in verse 15 here of John 2, in verse 15, John uses the same Greek term as Matthew and Mark use for money changer. Now it's just reversed and says changers' money. It's the same term. In verse 14, where it says changers of money, he uses an entirely different term. Verse 14, he uses an entirely different term. Different from himself in verse 15, different from Matthew and Mark. This is easy to explain, not easy just from this context, but I just finished doing a study of John's Gospel, and it's easy to explain. John, you just find this chapter after chapter after chapter, loves to deviate in small ways from statements that he himself uses. In other words, what I mean by that is when he's talking about the same event, he'll talk about it with 2 different words. He does that almost every single chapter of the Gospel. So, in other words, my point would be he's trying to make no difference at all. We would say, a different Greek term. He must mean a different group of people here. No. It's just like you'd call Tuesday, Tuesday. Someone else would call it the day before Wednesday. Someone else the day after Monday. We're talking about the same day. He likes variety. John the Apostle loves variety, and you won't see it in the English, but you'll see it remarkably in almost every chapter in the Greek, that he loves to deviate from common expression from what he himself has used earlier in his gospel. He's talking about the exact same thing, but he'll pick a different Greek word to refer to it. And then one other verse here in this context, Matthew 25:27, speaks of money changers. But just make a note there. We're not going to spend the time with that right now because I've got that down for another class. But just make a note that Matthew 25:27 does not apply at all to what we're talking about, money changers. It's another matter and another context entirely. Matthew 25:27. That's the only other place in the KJV that you'll find something like changers, money changers, changers of money. But it does not apply. It's not the Jewish money changer at all. Okay, have you learned something through that? Money changers. You can appreciate that context, that situation better. And then you make application to ourselves, and you go in your local church, and I mean this with all my heart, and I believe that it's just as valid today as it was then. And you find the breezeway just stacked and packed full of brownie cookies, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeers to be bought, a great thermometer on the wall to tell you whether you've reached your pledge or not, pens, buttons, Bibles, just about everything to buy, and you come in there to worship God. I'm of the same opinion that distracts a person's attention. Looking at all of the physical, carnal aspects of that, it distracts a person's attention from spirituality when you go and you see all of that. I think you almost could apply that just to the structure of the church itself. If the church is structured in such a way that it causes a person to be disturbed in their worship of God, and I mean disturbed by looking at all of the physical grandeur appearances there, then don't make my house a house of merchandise. The same response would be just as valid today as it's ever been. Someone could argue, well, we're supposed to be more spiritual. Well, we really end up being less spiritual because more churches than are not are filled with tricks and trinkets to buy. I remember the breezeway of our church, and it was the breezeway. You just breezed through there. It wasn't breezeway where two doors were opened on two ends and a breeze flew through. I think that was supposed to be the meaning because it did have two doors on two ends. But it was Grand Central Station. It was the Oriental Bazaar. It was the connection between the downstairs Sunday school rooms, the upstairs Sunday school rooms, the down the hall to the pastor and the secretary's rooms, as well as the sanctuary itself. All four of those parts of the building converged here at one spot that we call the breezeway. And in there were notes and bulletin boards and things up there and things to buy and things to sell and thermometers on the wall and the coat rack and umbrellas hanging hither and thither and all of this. And you go in there and try to worship God in the midst of all of that. Make not my house a house of merchandise. Don't disturb the worship of the Gentiles. This is a den of thieves and robbers. You see, we got three different points of view there and three different meanings behind all of that. A house of merchandise, a place of robbers. That might not necessarily be true so much in some churches because maybe it's giveaway prices or something. Still a house of merchandise, and it still disturbs the worship of the Gentiles. Not to speak of an occasional Jew that might come in church. And see this? That reminds me of the temple back in Jesus' day. Should have stayed a Jew. No better being a Jewish Christian, a Gentile now. Okay, so that's one way. Another way, that's one way to make money occupation, to raise yourself up to the upper class. Then the second way, and we're just going to barely get started on this, I can tell, is the so-called New Testament publican. There was a man who lived one day who thought the publican was the opposite of the Democrat. But that's a Republican. But what in the world was a publican? It's a mistranslation. It's a terrible phrase that happened to find its way into the New Testament and the King James Version and leads people astray, not only in the area of political faults and questions. They think that maybe being a Republican is more biblical than being a Democrat, because there were a few publicans back in the Bible. But it also gives you a distortion for the real meaning behind the concept, whether you think of politics or not. If you don't think of politics, just think of a publican. What is a publican? I've never met a publican before. I would have known that it was a person, except they are people in the Bible. Is a publican a type of fruit or a certain climate that you're in? See, what's a publican? It's a misnomer. Okay, tax collector, publican, tax gatherer. In the KJV, publican in the singular form is found 6 times. In the plural form, it's found 17 times for a total of 23 in the KJV.
The word behind it is telones. T-E-L-O-N-E-S. Telones. Now, I don't know whether you recognize that word from some things we've looked at already in taxation in the intertestamental period, but if you don't, we'll come back to it next time, or you can look in your notes meanwhile. And it would clue you in right away to what we're going to be talking about. Okay, the singular times are as follows. Matthew 10:3, Matthew 18:17, Luke 5:27, Luke 18, verses 10, 11, and 13. By the way, we're going to be looking at every one of these 23 passages. The plural times are as follows. Matthew 5:46 and 47, 9, verses 10 and 11, 11:19, chapter 21, verses 31 and 32, one time in Mark, that is in one place, 3 times. Mark 2, verse 15, and then twice in the 16th verse, for 3 times in Mark. One account, though, Levi. Mark 2:15 and 2 times in verse 16. Luke 3:12, Luke 5:29 and 30, Luke 7:29 and 34, Luke 15:1 and 19:2. 6 singular, 17 plural, 23 total. Notice that it is solely a synoptic term, only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's never found in John, it's never found outside of the Gospels. So it's only a synoptic term, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, in the Greek, we have 21 of telones. We have one of a heightened form of that, and that's in Luke 19:2, which gives us 22 total. That means we're missing one because of a variant. Let's deal with the variant to begin with. The variant is the Matthew 5:47 one. It's no big problem because they were mentioned in verse 46. Probably why they're not mentioned in verse 47 is he just mentioned them. But the King James follows the wrong variant here. If ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? That's fine. And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Here's the one time where we have got our variant, and I think you'll find in other versions that this will be changed to one of several different things. The term is ethnikos. E-T-H-N-I-K-O-S. Ethnikos. Comes from, the basic word is, of course, ethnos. Ethnos. We get our word ethnic, or ethnic, not ethic, rather, ethnic, from that. How should it be translated? Well, we're not going to get into the problems of this. You'll find it nations, you'll find it people, you'll find it Gentiles, you'll find it pagans, you'll find it heathen. You find many different translations. Maybe I better list all of those again. You'll find it as Gentile, you'll find it as nations, ethnikos. You'll find it as people. People's not really good. You'll find it as heathen, like it is over in Matthew 18:17. You'll find it as pagan, probably like the NIV has it, among other things. It's certainly not publicans. He's not talking about that group of people here in Matthew 5:47 because they follow a wrong variant. Evidently, what happened obviously in the scribal copying of this is that either A, he looked back up and saw publican in verse 46, or B, he just assumed that verse 47 was going to conclude like verse 46 and didn't take the time to look back to his exemplar and put publican in there as a result of that. So what we should have here is see, I have to pick one of those, and I don't want to get into that. What the word really means. You see, the Jews, this word gives us ethnic, okay? Gives us ethnic. Okay, we're talking about a different group of people than we are ourselves. So it has an ethnic overtone, an ethnic background to it. In the world, as far as the Jews were concerned, there were Jews. They stood on one side of the ledger, and on the other side of the ledger were Gentiles. And these Gentiles were heathens because they were not Jews. See, the Jews didn't recognize that you could be a heathen Jew at the same time, a heathen and a Jew. They were pagans. They were called the nations. See, Israel was the nation, singular. They were called the nations. Israel and the Nations is a book, I think, by F. Bruce. So there's Israel, that's the nation, and the nations. That's the other Gentile peoples of the world. So what the word really means is in contradistinction to what the Jewish people were, the other people out there. Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience, by the way. If ye salute your brethren only, you Jewish people, your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Don't even the other people of the world, outside of you Jewish people, which to us sin would be Gentile. To us would be Gentile. That's the way I would translate it, as Gentile. Because, yes, they were pagan, yes, they were heathen, but so were some Jews. They were pagan and heathen as well in their spirituality and their walk with God. So if we want one versus the other, if we have an opposite, we have to have an opposite here from your brethren, verse 47, the Jewish people, and that would be the Gentiles. Okay, so there's our one variant that we have to deal with. You subtract that from the KJV total of 23, and you'll end up with 22, which is really the Greek total that we'll have. Except there's one unusual form, why I said we only have 21 of telones in the Greek New Testament. There's an unusual form in Luke 19:2. In Luke 19:2, I hate to erase anything up there, as A-R-C-H-I, telones. Okay, A-R-C-H-I, architelones. This is what Zacchaeus was. He was an architelones. Well, you see telones is in the same word, though. T-E-L-O-N-E-S, telones. This is just a compound word. The word means something like first or beginning, and because it means first or beginning, it could mean the most important one, the greatest one. So what do we have? Behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was, this whole phrase here, the chief among the publicans, is architelones. That's represented by this many words, but it's only one Greek term. Which was architelones, the chief among the publicans, and he was rich. Now, here's a problem that we have. How does the NIV, someone got NIV? He was a chief tax collector. Okay, that's, you can get two different meanings out of what we have here. You can really only get one out of the NIV, and the NIV is an interpretation and not a translation. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that probably it's right, but it's difficult to be certain. He was chief among the publicans. Okay, what does that mean to you? There are many publicans out there, and we kind of think what that means is bad people. They're sinning people. And he was the worst of the group. You know, chief among sinners. When Paul calls himself the chief of sinners, he means the worst one. He doesn't mean the first one or the most important one. He means the worst one of the group. That's one meaning, and probably the chief meaning, the first meaning you'd get out of this in the KJV, Zacchaeus, which was chief among the publicans. The NIV, or just another way of looking at the KJV of Luke 19:2, would give us Zacchaeus was the top. They were ranking in some type of order here. And he was the chief tax collector. When you say chief among the tax collectors, and you say chief tax collector, you could get two different ideas, two different meanings in. So we're going to assume that probably the NIV has it right here, that he's chief publican, not chief among publicans, he's chief publican, which could only mean that he is the boss. There are other publicans that come underneath him. Now that's the only place it's found in the New Testament. That's why we don't have a lot of New Testament evidence to go on. Archicolones is only found here in this one place. Zacchaeus is chief publican. He's the top publican, which by implication means we have other publicans that come underneath him. Now we know Levi was a publican, but we don't have this reference to a chief versus a not a chief, which would give us other men underneath him. We know where he lives. Look up in verse 1. We know where he lives. That may help us whenever we get back to this. I'm running out of time now. That may help. I'm just trying to think of what I need to say before we quit. That may help us knowing where he lives in determining whether the NIV gives it to us right or our first inclination looking at the KJV is right. I think in telling us where he lives that he's a man in Jericho, and knowing where Jericho is and knowing about the city of Jericho will help inform us as to what type of man, what type of publican, whether he was the worst one in the group or the best one, the top one in the group, this man Zacchaeus was.